That winter came quietly, without storms or sudden freezes. Snow settled slowly, covering the ground in an even, careful layer, as if the land itself had decided not to hurry. Days passed one into another, calm and indistinguishable, and the nights were long but not hostile. Andrew's house stood slightly apart from the rest of the village, closer to the fields than to the road. The clay walls, once white, had darkened with time, especially near the corners where moisture and years left their mark. The windows were small, and in the evenings the light from inside barely reached beyond the fence. Inside, the house held a steady warmth. The stove gave off heat patiently, without crackling or noise, and the smell of dry wood mixed with old fabric and clay. It was the kind of warmth that stayed, settling into the walls and floors rather than filling the air all at once. Andrew lived there alone. People in the village knew that and had long stopped asking questions. Some stories, when left untouched, slowly lose their power to demand explanations. That evening, Andrew decided to sort through old things. He did not have a reason for it, nor was he looking for anything in particular. Winter often does that. It brings quiet hours and an urge to put things in order, even those that were never meant to be reopened. The chest stood against the far wall, heavy and dark with age. Its surface was scratched, the lid worn smooth where hands had rested years ago. Andrew lifted it carefully, and the wood responded with a low, tired sound. Inside lay folded linens, old shirts, a few notebooks, things that once had a daily purpose and now waited in silence. He moved them slowly, placing each aside, not rushing himself. At the very bottom, beneath a thin book without a cover, lay an envelope. It was clean, unmarked, and carefully folded. There was no name written on it, no address, no stamp. Andrew took it in his hands and stopped. The paper felt softer than it should have, worn by touch rather than time. He turned the envelope once, then again, and his chest tightened before he fully understood why. He recognized the handwriting immediately, not the letters themselves, but the movement behind them, the familiar slant and hesitation. It was Helen's handwriting. Andrew sat down at the table and placed the envelope in front of him. The lamp cast a steady yellow light, and the shadows from the chest stretched quietly across the floor. The stove continued its slow breathing, as if it did not want to interfere. He did not open the envelope right away, because he already knew something important. This letter had not been written for the road. It had been written for a moment of hesitation, and whatever was inside had once been strong enough to stop the woman he loved from sending it. The evening was only beginning. Andrew remained at the table longer than he intended. The envelope lay untouched, as if opening it too soon might disturb something that had been carefully preserved for years. He stood up only to add another log to the stove, watching the fire respond quietly, just as it always had. Helen used to say that a house reveals the truth of its people when nothing is being said. Back then, Andrew never thought much about that. Now, the memory returned with unsettling clarity. He remembered how she wrote letters. She never rushed them. She would sit at the table, pen in hand, then set it down and walk slowly across the room. Sometimes she would stand by the window, looking outside without really seeing anything, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. That was how he knew this letter had not been written in a single evening. There had been a time when letters were unnecessary between them. They shared the same space, the same meals, the same small routines that slowly become a life. Helen brought order into the house without ever announcing it. Andrew repaired things before they broke, believing that quiet care was enough. For a long while, it was. Then, almost without warning, something shifted. It did not begin with arguments or raised voices. It began with pauses, with moments when Helen would start a sentence and then stop, choosing silence instead. With evenings when she stayed at the table long after Andrew went to bed, papers spread out before her, untouched. He asked once if something was wrong. Helen smiled, but her eyes did not follow. "Nothing that can be fixed by talking," she said. At the time, Andrew accepted that answer. He trusted her judgment, perhaps more than his own. He believed that if something truly threatened them, she would say so plainly, but there were signs he ignored. She returned home late more often, especially after trips to the district center. Sometimes she stood by the door before entering, as if listening for something behind her. Other times she asked questions that seemed casual but lingered in his mind long afterward. Had anyone asked about him? Had anyone mentioned old matters? Had anyone come by while he was away? Andrew noticed these questions, but he did not connect them, not yet. The night she began writing this letter, the house looked much the same as it did now. The same lamp, the same stove, the same quiet outside the windows. Helen sat across from him, her head slightly lowered, a sheet of paper in front of her. "Are you writing again?" he asked. "I'm trying to understand something first," she replied. "And when you do?" She hesitated, then answered softly, "Then I'll decide whether it should be said at all." That was the first time Andrew felt a trace of unease, not fear, but something closer to distance, as if part of her attention had turned inward, away from the life they shared. He remembered falling asleep that night while she remained at the table, the pen unmoving in her hand. Now, years later, with the envelope still unopened, Andrew understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. This letter was not written in a moment of emotion. It was written during a long process of restraint. And whatever Helen had been deciding back then, she had decided it alone.
Andrew opened the envelope slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it contained. He understood that once he read the first line, the evening would no longer belong to him alone. Some things, once known, quietly take over the room. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded more than once. The creases were worn, softened by careful hands that had returned to the same words again and again. Andrew unfolded it fully and placed it closer to the lamp. Helen's handwriting was steady, but not confident. The letters leaned slightly, as if they hesitated before committing themselves to the page. Andrew recognized that hesitation immediately. It appeared whenever she wrote about things that carried consequences. The letter began simply, "Andrew, I don't know if I will ever give you this letter, but if I don't write it, I won't be able to remain silent." He paused, letting the words settle. They sounded less like a confession and more like a boundary she was drawing for herself. "You think I left because I was tired, or because I couldn't stay the way you expected me to. That isn't the truth." Andrew leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "I left because I understood that if I stayed, something would happen that could not be undone, and you would be forced to live with the consequences." One sentence was underlined. The ink pressed harder into the paper, as if she had not allowed herself any doubt. Responsibility. Andrew felt the weight of that word more than the others. There are things that cannot be fixed by conversation. There are decisions that look like betrayal, but are only a way of avoiding something worse. The handwriting changed slightly after that. The lines grew closer together, the words more compact, as though she had begun to hurry, afraid that time itself might interfere. "I am not asking you to understand this now. I am asking you not to look for me." Andrew stopped again. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the window, no stronger than a passing thought. He turned the page. The second half of the paper was blank. No signature, no date, no farewell. Only one final line, written lower than the rest, in darker ink. Silence is also a choice. Andrew folded the letter carefully and held it in his hands. What she had written did not explain everything, but it removed the simplest answers. She had not left out of indifference. She had not left out of weakness. She had left to prevent something. What that something was, the letter refused to say. Andrew looked toward the chest against the wall. For the first time, he wondered whether the letter was not the beginning of the truth, but the limit Helen had allowed herself to cross. Whatever she had been protecting him from, it was serious enough to demand her absence. And that meant the past was not finished with him yet.
Andrew remembered that day clearly, although for years he had told himself it meant nothing. Memory has a way of keeping what we refuse to examine, waiting until it can no longer be ignored. It was late autumn then, before the first real cold arrived. The morning had been ordinary, unremarkable in every way. Helen said she needed to go to the district center and would return by evening. She did not explain why, and Andrew did not ask. That had been their habit. She came back later than usual. Andrew noticed it the moment she stepped inside. She did not take off her coat right away. Instead, she stood near the door, listening, as if she were making sure that nothing followed her home. Only then did she move, slowly, deliberately, placing her things where they always belonged. "Did something happen?" Andrew asked. Helen looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. "No," she said. Then, after a pause, "Not yet." They ate in near silence. Helen barely touched her food. Several times she stood up and walked toward the stove, holding her hands out to the warmth, even though the house was not cold. Her movements were careful, controlled, as if she were trying not to draw attention to herself. That night, Andrew woke to the sound of quiet crying. It came from the storage room, soft enough that she probably believed he would not hear it. When he opened the door, Helen wiped her face quickly and looked at him with a steadiness that did not match her red eyes. "Please don't ask," she said. "If you know, it will only make things worse." That was the first time Andrew felt fear, not for what had happened, but for what might still happen. In the days that followed, Helen changed in small, precise ways. She asked careful questions about the past, about people Andrew had not spoken of in years. She wanted to know who still lived nearby, who had moved away, and who might remember certain old events differently than others. Once, while tidying the table, Andrew found a torn scrap of paper near the stove. Only one line remained intact. "If this comes out, you won't be able to stay here." At the time, he did not understand what it referred to. He threw the paper away and tried not to think about it. Now, sitting with the letter in his hands, the memory returned with clarity that left no room for doubt. Helen had not been silent because she did not trust him. She had been silent because she had learned something that made speaking dangerous. Andrew stood and walked slowly across the room, his gaze resting on the chest once more. The letter had not been written in response to a single moment. It had been written after she realized that knowledge itself could become a threat. Whatever she had discovered that autumn, it was powerful enough to turn explanation into risk. And once that line was crossed, silence was no longer a preference. It was protection. Andrew did not see the man himself at first. That was what made the memory so easy to dismiss later, as if it had never truly happened. Helen mentioned him only indirectly. The morning after her trip to the district center, she asked a question that did not fit the quiet rhythm of their life. "Has anyone been asking about you?" she said, as casually as she could manage. Andrew shook his head. Who would? She nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she already feared. That same evening, Andrew noticed unfamiliar footprints near the gate. They were heavy, deliberate, made by shoes no one in the village wore anymore. The tracks did not lead to the house. They passed by it, slowly, as if the person had only wanted to see where Andrew lived. When Andrew mentioned it, Helen said nothing. She only asked him to lock the door that night, something she had never insisted on before. 2 days later, she left again. This time she returned pale and exhausted, carrying no bags, as if the purpose of the trip had not been physical at all. She sat at the table for a long time before speaking, her hands folded tightly together. "There's a man," she said finally. "He works with old records." Andrew looked at her, waiting. "He isn't interested in truth, only in what can be used." She told him enough to be careful, but not enough to act. The man had come asking questions about a case from years ago, something Andrew barely remembered as more than a difficult period that had eventually passed. Officially, it had been closed. Unofficially, it had never been properly buried. "He knows your name," Helen said, "and he knows where you were standing when it happened." Andrew felt anger rise, sharp and immediate. "Then let him come to me." Helen shook her head. "That's exactly what he wants." She explained that the man had not approached Andrew directly. Instead, he had chosen her. He asked politely. He hinted rather than accused. He suggested that reopening the case would be inconvenient, unpleasant, and very public. "And if he does?" Andrew asked. Helen met his eyes. "Then they won't need proof. They'll need someone who fits." Andrew understood then what frightened her most. He lived quietly. He had few connections. No one would rush to defend him if his name resurfaced in the wrong place. "He said it would all go away," Helen added softly, "if certain people stopped being visible." Andrew stood up abruptly. "We'll leave. Together." "No," she said at once. "If you leave, it confirms interest. If I leave, it removes it." They argued then, quietly but intensely. Andrew spoke of fairness, of standing his ground. Helen spoke of systems, of momentum, of how easily attention turns into accusation. That night, she began writing the letter. Andrew remembered now how she sat at the table long after the fire had died down, how she folded and unfolded the paper, how she finally hid it instead of sealing it. She understood something before he did. The man was not dangerous because he was powerful. He was dangerous because he was patient. And patience, when backed by authority, does not require confrontation. It waits. Andrew did not go to sleep that night. The letter remained on the table, but his thoughts moved elsewhere, toward details he had once dismissed as coincidence. By morning, he knew he would not find answers inside the house. Some truths are stored where paperwork gathers dust, not where memories linger. The old administrative office stood behind the community hall. It had been renovated on the outside, but not inside, and the smell of paper and stale air had not changed. Andrew knocked once, then again. Michael, a retired investigator who now handled records, opened the door and stared for a moment before stepping aside. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said quietly. Andrew did not waste time. "Who was the man asking about me?" Michael closed the door and motioned for Andrew to sit. "He wasn't local," Michael said. "He was sent from the regional office. Officially, he was reviewing unresolved cases. Unofficially, He was looking for one thing. Andrew waited. A name that could carry responsibility without resistance. Michael pulled a folder from a drawer and placed it on the table, unopened. "Years ago," he continued, "you were present during that incident. You signed statements. You did nothing wrong, but that doesn't matter when a case needs a conclusion." Andrew frowned. "It was closed." "Paused," Michael corrected him. "Closed cases stay closed only when no one benefits from reopening them." Michael opened the folder just enough for Andrew to see his own name. "If that case resurfaced," Michael said, "you would not be accused directly. You would be framed as negligent, silent, convenient. That's all it takes." Andrew felt the weight of the words settle slowly. "And Helen?" he asked. "Helen came here before the man made his move," Michael said. "She understood what was happening faster than you would have." Andrew leaned forward. "What did she do?" Michael exhaled slowly. "She brought documents the man didn't expect, records that showed the responsibility lay higher up, where reopening the case would cause real damage. She made it clear that if they pushed your name forward, the consequences would not stay local." Andrew's hands tightened. "They backed off," Michael continued, "but not without conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "That the situation would lose its pressure point." Andrew understood before Michael finished speaking. "As long as Helen remained in your life, you were vulnerable. She was leverage, a way in, a reason to return." Andrew stared at the table. "She offered herself as the exit," Michael said. "She removed the reason to look at you again." "Couldn't she have just stayed silent?" Michael shook his head. "Silence works only when no one is watching. They were already watching." Andrew stood slowly, the truth settling with brutal clarity. Helen had not disappeared because she was afraid. She had disappeared because she understood the rules. As long as she was beside him, Andrew was a target. Once she was gone, he became uninteresting. That was the bargain she made. Outside, the morning air was cold and sharp. Andrew walked home without noticing the road, replaying every argument they had ever had, every moment he thought she was pulling away. She hadn't been leaving him, she had been removing him from danger. And the letter was never meant to explain her choice. It was meant to survive until he could understand it.
Andrew returned home before dawn. The house was cold when he stepped inside. The stove had burned out hours ago, and the silence felt sharper than the air outside. He did not light the fire immediately. Instead, he sat at the table and placed the letter in front of him, as if seeing it again might change what he already knew. Everything was clear now, too clear to ignore. Helen had not only protected him from a threat, she had protected him from himself, from the instinct to confront, to argue, to insist on fairness in a system that did not operate on fair terms. Andrew knew what he could do next. He could travel to the regional office and demand explanations. He could reopen the old case himself, force the truth into daylight. He could start asking questions that would make people uncomfortable again. Each option felt active, decisive, honest, and each of them would undo what Helen had achieved. He stood and walked to the window. The village lay quiet beneath a thin layer of frost. No movement, no witnesses, just the familiar shape of a life that had continued because attention had been removed from it. Helen had understood something he was only learning now. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for a reaction. Andrew turned back to the table and reread the final line of the letter. Silence is also a choice. She was not asking him to forget her. She was asking him not to replace her sacrifice with his pride. Andrew walked to the stove and opened the metal door. The ashes inside were still warm.
He held the letter above the opening for a moment, feeling the pull of a simple ending, but he did not let it fall. Destroying the letter would have been easy, too easy. It would have felt like control, like closure. Helen had never chosen the easy version of anything. Instead, Andrew folded the paper carefully, exactly the way she used to, and returned it to the chest. He placed it at the very bottom, beneath everything else, where it would not tempt him again. The letter was no longer evidence. It was a boundary. Andrew sat back down and made a decision that did not look like action at all. He would not search for her. He would not speak about the past. He would not challenge what had already been neutralized. He would live quietly, not out of fear, but out of respect. Helen had removed him from danger by disappearing. His responsibility now was not to pull her back into it. When the stove was finally lit and warmth returned to the room, Andrew felt something settle inside him. Not relief, not peace, something steadier. Acceptance.
Years passed quietly, not in a dramatic way, but steadily, almost carefully, as if time itself respected the decision that had been made. Winters came and went, each one familiar, each one slightly different, marked by small changes that only someone who stayed could notice. Andrew stayed. The house remained the same. The stove was repaired when it needed repair. The roof was patched when it leaked. The path to the well was cleared every winter, even when no one else seemed to care. Life continued without drawing attention to itself, and that was exactly what Helen had intended. No one came asking questions. No files were reopened. No names resurfaced. The danger she had removed did not return, not suddenly, not slowly, not at all. Whatever interest had once existed had moved on, redirected toward easier targets, places where resistance was louder and therefore more useful. Andrew learned to live with absence without turning it into loss. He answered questions simply when people asked, and stopped answering them when they stopped asking. He did not explain why the house remained unchanged, or why no new life entered it. Some things once chosen do not require defense. There were moments, of course, evenings when the quiet pressed harder than usual, winters when the cold seemed deeper, longer. On those nights, Andrew would sit by the stove and think not about what he had lost, but about what had been preserved. He understood then that Helen had not given him happiness. She had given him continuity. Because of her choice, his life did not break apart into explanations, accusations, and endless revisiting of the past. It remained intact, even if it remained incomplete. Once, many years later, a young man from a neighboring house helped Andrew fix a fence. As they worked, the boy casually asked whether Andrew had ever thought about leaving the village. Andrew paused before answering. "Yes," he said, "I did." "So why didn't you?" Andrew straightened and looked across the fields where the light was already fading. "Because staying was the harder thing to do," he replied. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing that the answer was finished. That evening, Andrew stood in his yard and watched the lights appear one by one in the village. Nothing remarkable happened, and that, he realized, was the point. Helen had not protected him so that his life would be extraordinary. She had protected it so that it could simply continue. And Andrew had honored that choice. One evening, long after winter had settled in for good, Andrew opened the chest again. Not out of restlessness, and not because something had changed. The house was warm, the stove burning evenly, and the night outside felt calm rather than heavy. He took the letter out and placed it on the table, exactly where it had once waited for him. It had done everything it was meant to do.
The letter no longer asked questions. It did not demand answers. It did not pull him backward. It simply remained as proof that someone, once, had chosen to carry more than her share so that another life could remain untouched. Andrew stood and opened the stove door. The fire inside was steady, patient, ready. He held the letter for a moment, feeling its weight one last time, not as evidence, but as memory. Helen had not left him. She had left for him. And now his responsibility was not to preserve the paper, but to honor the choice behind it. He placed the letter into the fire. The paper curled inward quietly. The ink disappeared. The words were gone within seconds, leaving no trace except warmth. Andrew watched until the flames settled back into their calm rhythm. Nothing in the house changed after that. The same table, the same stove, the same silence. But the silence was no longer holding anything back. Some stories do not end when they are told. They end when they are released. Andrew turned off the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time in many years, the night did not hold him awake. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt. We read every one of them. More quiet stories are waiting, shared slowly around the fire.